Hello, it's Kit Alowitz with yet another Leadership Journey video segment. Today, I would like to talk about institutionalization as well as integration, the pursuit of the idea of a learning organization. My intention is to persuade you to continue your own personal and professional pursuit to be a learning entity. That we, as a group of people that make up our company, must find ways to trigger or re-trigger the desire button to be a learning person, a learning team, a learning department, a learning functional group, a learning group, a learning organization. Intentionally taking time to learn is a quadrant 2 activity. It's important, but it is not urgent. It's easy to do, but it's even easier not to do. So you hear me often say, be a quadrant 2 person, important but not urgent. Now, I've been fascinated with the term learning organization for really probably 25 years, ever since I think it was the first time I heard the term from Peter Senge in his book, The Fifth Discipline. So what is a learning organization? Well, since an organization isn't a person, but it's really a collection of people, how do we get a whole bunch of people committed or interested in learning? Are you interested in learning? I'm talking about epistemic learning, the kind of learning that is not just facts and figures, but driven out of a general sense of curiosity and wonder. Perhaps a few of us come wired with this natural epistemic learning wiring as part of our DNA, and yet may I suggest that the vast majority of us, me included, don't come necessarily wired this way. It takes effort, it takes desire, it takes hard work to keep the epistemic learning juice working, flowing, and active. Now, more on that later. So back to this idea of a learning organization. I know that in fact a learning organization is really just a group of people. So does that mean that if an organization is just a bunch of people, and if those people were all committed to the ideas of learning, is that what a learning organization is? Could it be that simple? And yet could it also be that hard? What if not everybody is in fact committed or interested in this idea of learning within the organization? What if that's our organization? Does that mean that an organization isn't a learning organization if everyone that makes up the organization isn't committed to learning, like real epistemic learning? Can an organizational culture be installed or developed such that everyone, or at least the critical mass, the tipping point of the employees that make up the company, all feel and do and act and be learning-minded? These are all questions I ask myself often. Is a critical component, on top of that, of organizational growth driven by its employees being learner or learning-centric? Or is that maybe too fuzzy? So I looked up learning, and it's described as the process of acquiring new understanding, new knowledge, new skills, new behaviors, new values, attitudes, and preferences. Heck, the ability to learn isn't just processed or possessed, I should say, by humans. It's also possessed by animals, some machines, and even certain kinds of plants, as I've been doing research. And we know that leadership journey principles have been taught really focus in on this idea that knowledge is the prelude to change. In terms of asking of why talk about this learning organization concept, I do so in this video because we have learned that the term learning organization, it's also synonymous with this idea of institutionalization, the third eye. We have been learning and studying institutionalization now for some time as a leadership journey body. We know that in order to get to institutionalization, you first have to then internalize and integrate. So those are also critical steps if we're ever going to get to this idea of institutionalization. Institutionalization refers to the process of embedding values, beliefs, assumptions, principles within our organization. The distinguishing feature of institutionalization is that learning and knowledge are not simply embedded in the minds of individuals, but exist in the evolving relationships between individuals as a group and in a group level, and between groups at the organizational level. That's why we've been meeting as functional groups and cross-functional groups. Learning occurs in all social interactions at all levels we've been learning about. Learning and knowledge are rooted in the relationships between people cross-functionally and hierarchically. We committed this dynamic as a learning organization, or we're committed to, and this is why we say that the limits of our learning are the limits of our organization. Now, institutionalization, it also transforms an organization into a marketplace of learning, is kind of the idea here. A dense web of networks that produce the necessary insight and energy required to apply profound principles, knowledge, and then address organizational limitations while simultaneously generating new knowledge. Therefore, institutionalization is the process of anchoring learning that has occurred by individuals and groups into the organization's or institution's strategy, culture, and systems through cross-functional collaboration and hierarchical alignment. Additionally, institutionalization, it's a very real phenomenon and has very real consequences as a result of our buying into it and working on it and trying to make it part of the fabric of the way that we operate. However, this is the hard part, there is no recipe, there is no instruction book. The only ingredients are internalizing, integrating, and then insight. But internalizing, integrating, and insight do not necessarily combine, therefore, to create the phenomenon of institutionalization. They only create the unique conditions for institutionalization to occur. And this is the tricky part about it, and what makes it so elusive for most organizations to go after. Institutionalization is not a task, an activity, or a role. It is not something that you see in any sort of job description. In fact, it is not something that you will see like watching someone perform a certain behavior or watching a specific process taking place. Institutionalization is also, it's not a program or an event. It can't be forced, and therefore, thus the difficulty of trying to get there, and also this emphasis that we've been putting on for the past few months about the incubation period. You don't institutionalize once a quarter or on Fridays or our quarterly meetings or during institutionalization week. Institutionalization, it's a spontaneous organizational phenomenon that is difficult to describe, but when you get there, fantastic things can happen. Institutionalization, in addition to this, is not simply what happens within an individual like me or like you. It is not something that happens within a department. It is a horizontal and vertical crisscross of integration, which can be thought of as kind of the creation of an organizational neural circuitry or cultural consciousness. We as a group have talked about, discussed, written papers, and kicked around this idea of the 3 I's now for 2+ years. It's likely not going to go away because we want to get there. We know it's part of the preeminence package. There is something magical about the simplicity on the far side of complexity in describing the journey of change for you and I, for, again, both personally and professionally, of first integrating or internalizing new knowledge, then integrating it with others into our work life, and then finally through the intense, and it is, let me just stress, it is intense effort and turning that learning into a practice that is learned and then really woven and into the fabric of our being and institutionalize a collective body across our organization. That's what we're doing. So I continue to keep describing this, trying to help you and I paint a picture of what it is and is not knowing full well that there's not a recipe. I would suggest that we still have very much a large amount of work to do in order to get crystal clear as a group that things like institutionalization, it's an organizational phenomenon. Institutionalization, it counteracts functional silos and hierarchical slabs, as Matt's described them. That just because you and I internalize and integrate does not automatically mean that we will institutionalize. That institutionalization, it's really the toughest of the organizational challenges, and that's why most organizations don't do it, and that's why we are committed to get there. It essentially becomes you and I's responsibility to be curious. At the epistemic level, curious enough to really figure out the principles required at each of the 3 levels for us to get there. Now, by that I mean internalizing is a psychological outcome of the conscious mind reasoning about specific concepts and incorporating it into the subconscious mind at a motive level. Right? You're always hearing Matt talking about the motive level. No individual is restricted I'm suggesting, in any way from internalizing the idea, concepts, or principles. Next integration is the personification and application of internalized concepts and ideas which are manifested at our individual and collective behavioral levels. Integration does not require that a formal organizational structure be in place. Institutionalizing, therefore, is establishing integrated beliefs as a tacit underlying assumption level and embedding those integrated principles and practices as norms into our organizational culture. And this is the tricky part and the play on words to try to get there. It is the process of anchoring individual and group learning into our strategy, our structures, and our systems. Institutionalization, therefore, can frame or reframe our culture and make it a verb, an action verb, not a noun. It also clearly demonstrates that culture it's not transformed by leaders per se, it's transformed through leadership. Managers and leaders play a critical role, but we all are part of the solution. There's some subtle differences here. Institutionalization, for example, is an ongoing social process of renewing and reinforcing our organizational culture. So here's one useful strategy, or analogy I should say, is to think of internalizing as ingesting food, integrating as digesting that food, and then institutionalizing as metabolically having that food become energy throughout the body. So to a large degree, my friends, you and I ought to be perhaps intrigued or amazed or even humbled when we think about the phenomenon of institutionalization. Every individual makes their contribution. Every level and function together makes their contributions. Alignment and collaboration reflect the obligation at the hierarchical levels and functional units to individually and collectively making their contributions, all resulting in the creation of something greater than the individual, greater than the functional or cross-functional levels, something greater than just the organization in and by itself. Matt has stated several times that many organizations, they want to know how to do it. They want the recipe. They want the to-do list of being or getting to institutionalization. Matt says they want it meaning something like becoming also this learning organization. Perhaps even it meaning, how do you and I get this desire to want to be a learning-centric person, right? What's the recipe for you and I wanting to be interested at a personal level to be learning and a collective then be a learning organization? I admit I'm often tempted to take that big, fat, juicy marshmallow. Just tell me how to get there. Just give me the recipe book. Give me the 7 steps. I want to follow a recipe. I like following recipes. I want to know the steps to plan the outline. Matt has stated that the hardest thing when talking about institutionalization is not telling people how to do institutionalization, because examples, as he often says, they're a crutch. No one learns from examples, which I know can be somewhat of a controversial, mind-numbing idea to think about. He even says that copying is a curse. So we're on this journey individually as an organization without trying to copy someone else, but certainly maybe we can learn from the past and become learner-centric ourselves so that we can organizationally, collectively get there. Are you, or I should say for you, are any of the following examples then examples of potentially institutionalization that has happened within our organization? If one of our leaders becomes or begins to quietly learn about the business by spending time on the shipping docks, receiving docks, or attending a departmental and cross-functional group meeting, is that an example of institutionalization? If an AVP recognizes that he or she must begin to operate at phase 3 and realizes that his or her obligation is then in fact to institutionalize, is that an example of institutionalization of our organization? Especially if they then push other AVPs to do the same. If departments or functional groups begin to communicate and explore their obligations to institutionalize principles across the organization, thus spanning all levels and functions, is that an example of institutionalization in our organization so far? If a hierarchical level within our organization explores It's failure at collaborating in order to raise each other's level of performance as it relates to alignment and cross-functional collaboration. If that occurs, is that an example of institutionalization? If these four examples occurred as a result of asking the question, what is our obligation to institutionalize principles across the organization, both horizontally and vertically, are we beginning to get there? My last example, let's make it 5, are the summits an example of institutionalization? Have the summits transformed from, let's say, just an individual program that we're getting together 2 or 3 times a year into an institutionalized cultural phenomenon operating through cross-functional collaboration and hierarchical alignment? Only us, I guess, the people that make up the organization, can answer that question. I tend to think that we're beginning to see some examples. Maybe it's more integration than institutionalization, but I'm asking you, what do you think? So, saying again, these last 5 examples, they could be examples of institutionalization, provided that they emerge from a dialogue in which everyone learns something. In other words, the examples did not originate, or my question to you is, if they did not originate from a list of activities that were brainstormed, they were not someone's pet project, the ideas were born from dialogue. Also, if they didn't exist or before the dialogue began, but they existed because of the dialogue, that could be examples of inching that we're making on our own pursuit to get there. So let me just talk about for a minute the benefits to our organization if we're willing to hang in there. They include things like we should be, or we will be able to achieve some nice integration and some alignment horizontally and vertically within our organization, which will make things work smoother. We should be able to see increased strategic conversations happening at all our levels. We'll also be able to see higher innovative thinking, creativity, and systems thinking. We'll likely be able to tap into some real value and finally maybe get to the far side of complexity of feedback, dialogue, and respectful listening. We'll likely all achieve a more sophisticated understanding of our business. We'd for sure sharpen our problem-solving skills and root cause analysis capabilities. We'd be more adept at finding applications and integration of the 64 principles. We'd likely increase the number of things the collective organization stops doing that are really probably getting in our way of preeminence. To give you also some examples or evidence to be on the lookout as you are looking to see or potentially see integration taking hold amongst us and amongst our organization, let me just give you a laundry list. We'll see an increase in internalization and integration of principles amongst us as we have our conversation. We see the establishment of new and unconventional behavioral norms. We'll see the formation and observation of mutual influence and relationship building going on. We'll see dynamic interaction amongst occupational subcultures that exist within our organization. We'll see cross-functional communities coming together of learning and practicing that just happen naturally. We'll see development and implementation of integration mechanisms that would start to happen. We would see the reduction of any sort of hierarchical influences that in the past would have created maybe isolation and insulation amongst us. We would learn and unlearn faster. Succession planning becomes more decentralized. Our talent development increases significantly. Our problem solving is more efficient and effective. Our strategic planning evolves to more strategic analysis and action. We see tactical and strategic unification. We observe new employees assimilating faster. We see employees' selection process improving dramatically. We see controllable turnover decreasing where we can control it. We also see voluntary and involuntary turnover increasing. We clearly see an organizational-wide level of tolerance reduced. We see innovation at all levels increasing. We observe less concern about the chain of command. We all focus more on the circle of influence versus the circle of concern as we're working day to day. We might see a reduction in our concern and tampering with organizational structure, an increase in concern and thinking about organizational design. We would see more seeking of feedback. We would solicit support. We would more internally or informally coach and mentor. We would create more meaning and cognitive conscious through dialogue interactions. We would share and generate knowledge more freely. The list goes on. There's so many examples of what it could look like without giving a recipe. For example, we would identify and eliminate root causes and problems easier and quicker and faster. We would see silos dissolving. We would see processes improving. We would see disruptions in the momentum that cause change of trajectories towards wider business actions going down. We would see a more homogeneity of cultural consciousness. So there's a whole bunch of things that we could be looking for without having a recipe book. The challenge with this list is if we don't consciously make it happen, if we don't make it happen, if we're forced, or if we're thinking that we have to make it happen, that's better said. If we think we have to make it happen, if we force it, my friends, it's not institutionalization, it's something else. It happens naturally, organically. But the list that I gave includes all sorts of evidence that it is getting there if we see some of those examples that I provided going up or going down or reducing or increasing. So I request from you a couple of things. Number one, get or maintain an individual perspective of continued improvement or commitment to internalization and personification of 64 principles. Number two, getting or staying this level of epistemic curiosity, fending off the temptation that you have successfully completed the leadership journey, because it's not a journey, it's not a destination that we get to, it's a journey that we're on. Next, practice mutual influence and go for mutual purposes in dealing with others. Ask yourself, as well as the collective amongst us, your functional groups, as following, or the group of us, the following. What is my role and responsibility amongst one another and amongst myself? What is my obligation, our duty as an individual and group to ensure the principles are being institutionalized, integrated across the functional departments and throughout our hierarchical levels? It's really that simple, and it's really that complex. The simplicity that lies on the far side of complexity is the fact that online tools of institutionalization, the online tools for this type of institutionalization, are language and the learning. It's the language we use and the learning that we pursue. The complexity lies in the fact that there, in fact, as I've said before, there's no recipes, there's no instruction books, there's no directions. In a real sense of the word and the concept that I'm talking about in this video is that institutionalization, it's an output, because it comes, when it comes to institutionalization, the process is the output. Consider, as I'm winding down here, that you and I are not behaving as individuals or acting as functional groups. We are in fact creating networks. Build, invest, be curious, prevent believing, or always on the hunt for some sort of silver bullet to this idea of the third I, or institutionalization. There is no silver bullet. It's a process, it's a journey. Prevent, also, I would invite you to consider, prevent implementing programs that solve problems instead of preventing problems. We're not trying to always be solving issues, we're trying to prevent them, and that's the idea, that the journey that we're on. Next, think you and I in terms of successfully completing the leadership journey. There is no completion. It's not somewhere we're going to get to. It's an ongoing journey that will always be evolving. So here's my powerful emotional close. Although organizational culture cannot be changed directly, institutionalization proves an opportunity for actions and programs or process to have an immediate cultural impact, because they can be validated and integrated efficiently and effectively. Institutionalization is an organizational capacity, not the sole responsibility of just one person or one group. Few organizations can reach the level of institutionalization or institutionalization learning, or learning organization. That's why few organizations ever get there. We want to be different. They do nurture the environment or the conditions to produce that possibility. We are on that hunt. We have to be open to exploration and being aware of what we don't know. At the institutionalization level or stage, our organization, in fact, will thrive on this idea of or this place of preventing problems, which allows us then the freedom to focus on something as lofty as the excellence and the idea of preeminence. Help you and I get there, help our organization get there, be committed to it, be a eccentric, ongoing, lifetime learner. I'm Kit Allowitz. See you next time.